So, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Giles Gillette from NASCEE, and really good to have another one of these Tuesdays in the Trenches sessions. The idea of these sessions is they're conversations to connect us, to help us get new information that we might not have had before, to think about or hear about topics that we align to or that we work in connection with. And so it's really just about helping us connect around a common purpose of wanting to see transformation happening in our education sector. We started off the series this year looking at women in leadership, which I think went really well, and it was interesting to get a diverse group of leaders in different times of their leadership career, and to get some insights. Today's session is around rural education and how do we support rural schools in economically disadvantaged communities differently? What does that mean? And we're joined by a really great panel of people that spend a lot of time thinking about this and working in a rural setting. And I think it is an economically disadvantaged settings. They obviously they come together, but there are obviously some rural schools that have different circumstances. But I'm keen to hear about this conversation. I think it's going to be really interesting for us. It's often a topic that isn't given front and center. We often just talk about previously disadvantaged or disadvantaged communities, but I think rural settings have a specific nuance that I haven't thought about enough, and I'm keen to hear more about, because a lot of our schools are in rural settings. And that's a reality that I think we really need to think about, and what are the differences around those. So I'm joined by Viwe, who's hosting this with me. Viwe is with NASCEE. She's a consultant that works with us. So Viwe, thanks for all your work behind the scenes, and I'm going to hand over to you just to set it up and to get us going and to introduce our panelists. Thanks, Viwe.
Thank you so much, Giles. And again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll do a very short introduction of our panelists, just so we can have an idea of who we're talking to. And then also just general housekeeping. You're more than welcome to upload or share questions you've got during the course of the panel in the chat box, but we'll also have a Q&A at the end where you can also just unmute yourself and ask any questions. So today we're joined by Zonke Ngidi, Craig Paxton, and Mary Fenter. Zonke is the Executive Director of the Leap Institute in South Africa. Craig is the Executive Director and co-founder of Axiom Education, and Mary Fenter is a Senior Executive and Strategic Director of Khululeka Community Education Development Center. So really powerhouses in the sector, and who, like Giles said, are doing amazing work in supporting rural schools and economically disadvantaged communities, specifically in the Eastern Cape, but around the country as well. So I think we'll get started with our first question. And I'll start with Mary, if you don't mind. I think firstly, we just want to get a general introduction into who you are, but more specifically, what motivated you to work in the education sector.
Thanks so much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel, and just to hopefully shed some light on some of the realities that we do face being an organization that is based in rural Eastern Cape. So, as already introduced, my name is Mary Fenter, and I'm the Executive Director of Khululeka. We are based in Queenstown, or now known as Komani, in the Eastern Cape. So it is very decentralized, and we work predominantly across very rural and scattered villages and communities. My background history is a little bit different. I'm actually a professional accountant, so I was very much in the formal sort of financial world for quite a while, and my path crossed with the previous or the founding director of Khululeka, and I was brought on the team as their finance director. And through a succession within the organization, but also understanding sort of my desire to want to make more of a change than just dealing in the financial components, it really led me to want to understand how do we create something or shift things in a feasible, financially sustainable way, especially understanding some of the significant barriers and burdens that we face with the geographical context of what we and cultural context that we live in South Africa. So yes, very much more from the financial world, and obviously just I think an embedded love and passion for understanding what education can do and bring in terms of change for every single individual within the country. And then understanding that the foundation has to start with ECD. It's understanding that we will not create the change that we desire to see unless we really work on the critical foundations. So I was lucky enough for those paths to cross, and now find myself really in a space to advocate for those that don't always have the voices to be able to advocate for. But yes, I'm going to leave it there to allow time for everybody else, but it just gives you a little bit of background about myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And we'll actually engage a bit more later on the part that you mentioned on the cultural context and working in the environment that you're in. So I'm excited that you've mentioned that already. Zonke?
Thanks, Viwe, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see some familiar names like Judy and Jenny, with everyone else that has joined. So, I mean, every time I answer this, I'm asked this question, for me, it's more of a personal journey because I believe even the reason why I decided to become a teacher was because of my personal experience having been a product of two very different educational environments. I went to public schooling in Kualanga in Cape Town, and my primary schooling was there, and it was abusive is an understatement. We used to get literally teachers would walk in and beat us up because they feel like it. And as a young person or as a child, you never felt safe, you never felt protected because the very same adults that were supposed to keep us safe were the very same ones that were harming us. And it was normalized, it was normal behavior to be beaten up with those plumbing pipes. And it's just how school was. And so at the time, I remember I hated school like any other young person that was exposed to public education at the time because the violence in schooling was just normalized. And I always say if it wasn't for my own grandmother, I would have quit a long time ago. So I really understand why children end up bunking out of school or quitting school because schools are not spaces, but particularly public schooling are not spaces where children feel safe and nurtured and loved. And so I went through primary schooling with that belief that hate school got nothing to do with what I want to be and who I want to be. And then I went into a different environment, and that was through the league schools, and I did my high schooling there, and that was a very different environment. Because for the first time, I got to understand what these words of loving and nurturing spaces in education feel like. And I remember remembering the fact that when when I was in my primary schooling, when I was in grade 6, we had a classmate of ours that had committed suicide. And you can imagine a grade 6 child, what do they know about even killing themselves? But that's what had happened. And they had said to the letter that they had left was that they did that because no one loved them. So I remember going back to this memory while I was asleep and thinking, surely children have to understand that it does get better. It can get better. Education can become a loving space and become a space where children are seen and nurtured in that space as well. So my reason of wanting to become a teacher was that drive of saying children from Langa need to understand that it can get better. Obviously, it grew beyond that and other communities that I was involved in education. But till today, I think my personal drive is for children to know that education and schools and classrooms can become nurturing and loving spaces. So that would be my driving reason as to why I'm still here. Thanks, Steven.
Thank you so much, Zonke, for sharing that very intimate personal story. Thank you. And Craig.
Hi everyone, excited to be here. So I started off as a disillusioned chemical engineer and really didn't choose education. It felt like it chose me. I would say I fell in love with it. Both both being in the classroom, I just loved being a teacher. And then in particular, in my first year of teaching, I spent 6 weeks up in a rural community in KZN that just profoundly shaped me and I guess my life's trajectory. And I'd say, so part of it was just because I loved being there. I loved the work. I loved the kids. I loved everything about it. So that was the personal drive. But the kind of professional drive as well, it just made me curious. And whether it was the engineer in me that wanted to solve problems, but I looked around and I was teaching in a relatively well-off public school. But all around me were hundreds of schools that kind of didn't have the same level of privilege, and yet these kids were smiling and walking to school every day as if all was fine. And I think that got me thinking and researching eventually and working eventually in rural communities in a way that I guess, like Giles introduced the topic, for most of us, rural is on the margins, and a lot of the research around rural schooling speaks about this. Is that it's in the periphery of our minds. It's in the periphery of the media. Occasionally we hear about mud schools, but largely it's a peripheral issue, and yet the numbers are serious. I mean, 30 to 40% of our schools are still rural. And of course, there's been a huge trend towards urbanization, and there will continue to be. And yet, it's as if this 30, 40% of our kids are completely neglected and left behind. And often that's not intentional. When I speak with, and we're going to talk about government in a moment, but when I speak with district officials and provincial officials, they care deeply. They've often come from those communities themselves. And yet the kind of structural barriers, the kind of historical barriers that we have mean that our rural schools continue to be neglected. So to kind of reconnect that with my personal story, I was very curious about what was going on, and that led me to study further, etc. But it's grounded me in the sense of how do we both think about these rural as different, but also think about rural as having huge potential, particularly the kids. I've never met kids that have as much motivation as some of the children that we work with. There's a huge amount of potential that when we ignore that 30-40% of our nation, we're neglecting a huge segment of our population that can really change the country for better. So there's a real opportunity, and reframing it rather than all the things that rural doesn't have, thinking about what could we do if we just thought about this a little bit more carefully and supported it a little bit more thoughtfully. So yeah, that's me, Vera.
Thanks so much, Craig. Also for sharing the personal motivation for you doing the work that you do. So I think in the context of what you've all shared, my follow-up question really is around some of the challenges you've experienced in working in rural communities or economically disadvantaged communities, and how you've navigated them, especially as leaders in organizations. So, I mean, Zonke, you mentioned that children at times don't feel like schools in these communities are loving and nurturing and care for them. Mary, you mentioned the cultural challenges and context that come with working in a rural community. And Craig, you've just shared a bit about the structural barriers that lead to why our schools or our schools are challenged in being in these rural communities. So maybe let's start with Zonke, if you can share how you've navigated some of the challenges you've experienced in working in rural communities.
Sure, thanks, Vera. I mean, outside of the usual in terms of lack of access, infrastructure, these are things we know, and challenges that whatever we are seeing in townships, I feel sometimes it's double when it comes to the rural communities. So lack of even just toilets. Craig spoke about the mud classrooms and so on. those are challenges that we are facing in the everyday life of us being there. But there's two main ones from my end that come up as a highlight. One is, and I say this carefully because Craig, you put it well. You said, the department has got good intent in terms of wanting to good for the children, but sometimes the organization and the structures don't manifest in the way that the intent is intended for. And so, for an example, one example that comes up for me is recently the department, the big department building in Mthatha got burnt down, right? And I remember the day we were actually having meetings in the building, and we were planning and putting together workshops and so on. And literally an hour after leaving that building, we are told the building is on fire and it's burning down. That's a building that's got massive data in terms of the various departments that are occupying there and so on. So you can imagine how much setback that produced in terms of the work that we were working together on, collaborating on, and so on. So, and there's all sorts of rumors as to how that building got burned. So we won't go into that, but sometimes it's those type of things where there's agendas that are happening within the department that are deliberately meant to dismantle some of the processes that are in place, or deliberately meant to delay some of the work that is in place because someone else is not part of the conversation, or that person was not spoken to. So it's all these. I mean, part of it is egos and so on, but I feel sometimes that the department is sometimes stuck on how they can be able to manifest some of these plans and good intent that they have. So lots of delays in terms of work because of that. And we want to work with the department. So it's not a matter of saying, well, because of these challenges, there's nothing we can do. So we carry on and we have the conversations and we continue to engage and collaborate with the department. So that's one. And the second one is because we are also community focused. So yes, we're education, but we see ourselves as an entry to the end goal of community impact. We have noted that, as someone who grew up in the city, for an example, you have certain challenges that you see in the townships that manifest very differently in society in the rural areas. So one, for an example, you might have a child from Alex who's struggling with drug addiction or is wanted by the police for whatever reason, and because the parents have got family in the Eastern Cape, then they take the decision to say, well, now Zonke, you are going back to the Eastern Cape because we don't know what to do with you anymore. Zonke goes back to the Eastern Cape, but remember, Zonke has got behavior and very destructive behavior that she was doing in that community. So by the time I land in Eastern Cape, of course, I'm going to continue with that behavior. So what's manifesting now in rural communities that knew nothing about what Dick was, knew nothing about what some of these societal problems that we are seeing manifest are now coming through and seeping through into the community because we've had some sort of influx of city influence that has come through in the community. So we're dealing with problems where even the chiefs are saying, we are not sure how to deal with this one. And drug addiction was never something we had to deal with as a rural community. So we don't know where to go to, how to make sure we deal with drug addiction in our communities. In one of the events that we were attending in Tabase, in one of the villages we're working with, as we were arriving, we saw a group of people, cuddling together. And as we stopped to see, it was one of the teachers of the schools that we're working in, shot dead next to the school, actually. And it's an incident that happened in the morning. When we tried to find out what happened, the community was saying it had to do with livestock theft. So that's another big problem, right? So we talked crime in the townships, but how that manifests in rural communities, that people are actually getting killed now because of livestock theft becoming a huge issue in the community. So it's finding ways of saying when a teacher is literally killed in the morning of a workshop that you are going into the school to do, and the reason is that it's livestock theft, you have to find a way of being able to say, how do we bring these communities back into the classroom, into the schooling environment? Because that's a teacher, that's a member of this community. So if this is something that is really affecting this community, how do we bring together, these companies? And that's what we've done, to really try and use the school as a space for us to be able to engage either with the chiefs, with the ward councillors, but have these conversations going on as to how do we solve them together as a community.
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing, Zonke. Craig?
Yeah, I'll speak about two aspects, the one personal and the one professional. So the part of kind of our philosophy as an organization is to be present, sikona. And what that means is, we raised our kids in a rural village, and so we lived there. And for me personally, there was a lot of adjustments, I guess, being white and male and all of those things around just what I found my view of the world was insufficient for what I was encountering on a daily basis. And what I mean is some things like, you look at a school and why are those buildings not maintained? Or you look at teacher attendance. Why are these teachers not attending school? And then one of our core values as an organization is to understand first. And so you start to unpack a little bit of this, and you realize that when you need to find a building to house your organization's office, well, there are no buildings to rent, so you have to build. And you suddenly realize the challenges that those schools face around, gosh, actually, it's not very easy to find local builders or skilled builders. It's not very easy to find materials, et cetera. You start to understand that teachers have spent an hour and a half getting to school and need to return an hour and a half back this afternoon. And so no wonder the attendance, maybe their child is sick at home, or there are so many reasons that for the way that things are. And so just for me personally to try and understand and to get a better understanding of context was really important. And then I think a recent kind of realization for me professionally has been that most rural schools really operate on a Maslow's hierarchy of needs of actually just daily survival. And so when we as an organization try to be helpful, right? And we bring something like teacher coaching. Now, of course, teacher coaching is helpful. It's going to help you improve as a teacher, but actually that teacher can't receive that. They're barely trying to just figure out there are only 2 teachers to cover 100 kids today. So, your teacher coach is really not going to be helpful. Actually, what they need is more warm bodies in the building. And so I think just realizing once again with some recent experiences that getting people to a level of they're okay as a person and their school has what they need on a very basic level before we can start to bring great initiatives that might well be helpful but need some kind of a foundation before you can build on them has been, I guess, part of thinking about some of these challenges that rural schools face. Over to you, Mary, I assume.
Yes, thank you, Craig.
Yeah, I actually just want to build on what the previous 2 speakers spoke about, but also really bring in and highlight sort of the ECD component in this all. For us, working in ECD, and I think we have to note, based on everything that's sort of been mentioned, because we see very much the same challenges and we experience the same challenges, and understanding that as a country, South Africa has changed, and that's just due to evolution of how things have evolved, the influx of substance abuse and the extreme poverty that we do see obviously has a critical impact on how people function and operate. Traditionally, rural areas were always actually seen as that safe space. Like you were saying earlier, they had a slightly different way of operating. There were different sort of norms and standards around the safeguarding of those communities. And what we've seen is that's changed over the years. So it means that there is more violence, there is probably more inequality than what we've been seeing. And that's really because of what you were speaking around the survival, this need that every day these individuals in these communities are just trying to survive. But to put that into the context of ECD is understanding that ECD for us for a long time was seen more as an informal space. It's still in the process of being, in my opinion, appropriately recognized. We talk about the professionalization of ECD, in which we're just grappling with the basics of how do we raise awareness about the importance of ECD so that we feel like people are prioritizing their children having intervention. But I often say to people, when you talk about prioritizing ECD or prioritizing a decision in these rural communities, often it's not about prioritizing, it's about choosing survival over other needs and other services. And like you mentioned about, more formal schools and understanding that every day they probably lack sufficient human resource capacity, lack access to sufficient resources, that all has a significant impact on somebody's ability to be able to show up, be present, and offer, high quality teaching and learning experiences. So, and I do want to say, you were giving a basic context of saying you have a lot of people that have to travel far distances with road conditions that are very poor. And when we try and logistically plan how we are going to access and support these communities, that in itself becomes a challenge where you do have lack of infrastructure already from a base ground level. You have a lack of capacity and skills within those communities. Just in trying to establish new centers, it's always trying to find practitioners, support them sufficiently well, but then also support the families. So the way we generally work with these communities, we talk about holistic intervention and understanding that we're putting the child in the center of it, but we have to have systems around it that enable it and support it, which we're still not quite at a space where there is sufficient recognition of the work that's been done by ECD practitioners. And that's meant to be your pipeline of what's going to go into, your grade R and your grade one, and it's laying that foundation for why we're seeing the challenges in later development in young children. But I just want to say, in terms of, those challenges, like you said, and actually, no, sorry, I'm just thinking of some of the other questions that'll probably come up. I was going to say there's always a bit of a pro and con to this, but it's really understanding the dynamics that can happen within a community, understanding how they structure themselves, how they operate sort of intrinsically to values that are incorporated within their villages. And we have to give ownership. We have to incite the process of giving responsibility to be part of generating a solution, which I know isn't easy, but it's understanding that they still want to feel capacitated and empowered to be leaders within their communities, and understanding that these are individuals that also have aspirations in terms of changing the circumstances that they're in, but sometimes without the means and resources to be able to do it. So yeah, it's a very complex actually question to try and unpack, but I would say some of the biggest challenges, and we face it when we're working, even negotiating with donors and funders and negotiating with other partners, is really understanding the logistical challenges and practicality of trying to access some of these areas, trying to support in some of these areas, and understanding the embedded community culture and environments that they already have that govern the way they operate, and how those communities then function.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you all. I think for me, what was ringing in my mind as you were all responding to this question is how these education institutions, and it's especially said in the context of higher education, how they're a microcosm of society. And so I think there's such an importance to remain aware of the challenges that face rural communities and how those give context to the challenges that you'll then see in the schools in these rural communities. So thank you all for your contributions. So I'll hand over to Giles for our next two questions.
Thanks, Kiwe. I think I'm going to pick up on Mary, what you were speaking to around, culture and leadership, and I'm interested to get a sense of the sort of nuances or differences between rural schools and more urban schools around how leadership is how it shows up by the school principals or school managers, by government officials that are supporting those schools, and the actual community itself, or the sense of tribalism that exists in our rural settings, that some of us understand and some of us, certainly I've got a very limited view of it, but I'd be keen to hear how those leadership structures interact with each other in a collaborative way to support learning for children, and the priorities that brings, and where those potentially clash, or if they clash. I'm not sure if they do. So yeah, I don't know, Mary, if you want to have a crack at that and then pass it on, just from your perspective in the ECD space.
Yes, I was going to say, specifically in the ECD space, for us, so we speak a lot about community entry and community engagement and community mobilization, and how we actually effectively achieve this. For us, as I've said, because we deal a lot with actually establishing sort of centers within areas where there is no access, our goal is to create something that's sustainable. And because of the types of structures that are already in place, it means our consultative process within those communities is essential and key to what the sustainability will be of those new ECD sites. Often we've got to go through a recruitment process where people are vetted, and they're vetted internally by those communities to understand, are these individuals in these communities that should be partaking in the types of programs or services that are going to be delivered with young children. But I do want to highlight, and you'd said it, how does it look in terms of when you break it down to a local level or district level, and when you bring in other stakeholders? And again, I'm going to tentatively say this because I don't think it is necessarily the norm, but it is a very real challenge that we have, which creates significant barriers most of the time. And that's just the individual that's responsible at different levels. If you have the wrong individual, sort of with not the right intent or the right purpose and direction, especially if it's district officials or even if it's senior headmen in relation to how those communities works, it can create a very significant barrier in terms of how we work. So sometimes it's a luck of a draw, and it's trying to really nurture relationships. And that's the big thing in actual fact in leadership and within these communities that we work in, is establishing relationships that are built on trust, transparency, and trying to empower them to be able to make the decisions and take ownership of what the processes are. But if there are already systems in place, I mean, it's a very real reality of what we're facing with the registration process now, and trying to get people through on the Banapele registration from a bronze to a silver. This is when the centers are actually formally registered and will be able to access subsidy. And in some of the districts, we're seeing great uptake because we have strong relationships with district officials, but as well as those community officials that we're working with. And in some of the others, and it's not due to a lack of effort, it's just due to the contextual situation of how some of those villages are incorporated, or even how some of the district officials see the types of programs that we are bringing in. So it's unfortunately not a one size fits all. I think it has to be in terms of, if you're bringing in that leadership component where you understanding the type of relationship you're trying to create, it really speaks volumes, but it takes a huge amount of time as well to nurture the right relationships, to create the right trust and transparency that hopefully mobilizes those communities in a way that they are more active. But again, it's difficult when you are working in a space that is not necessarily prioritized or acknowledged by district officials or even senior officials that are meant to be supporting those ECD centers, and especially for these practitioners. I'm just going to link back to something that was said in the beginning. The practitioners that we're dealing with generally have faced some form of trauma, and they themselves are needing support and coaching and ways to be able to uplift themselves. And they are the ones that are responsible for developing and nurturing our young children. So that investment of how you are doing it is extremely important. But again, we don't necessarily have control over a lot of the social economic challenges that they face. Yeah, so I don't want to go into too much detail because there's a lot more around it, but
it's a big topic.
Yes,
Yeah,
it really speaks to the context of the types of relationship that you have and the types of structures that are already in place.
Yeah.
To change a system in itself is something that's extremely challenging.
Of course. Thanks, Mary. I think that also gives us a sense of the dynamic certainly between government and the community. Craig, what's been your learning around the kind of on the ground cultural issues? I'm thinking specifically parents, community leaders, chiefs, that kind of thing. And how's that positive? Are there models of where that's playing out in a really positive way for young people? And I suppose what are some of the challenges you guys are solving?
Yeah. So we have some nice contrasting examples of that, Charles. So we work in the former Transkei, so very traditional areas still, where there are quite functional traditional authority structures. And we've been fortunate to work with a couple of absolutely phenomenal local chiefs who have such a vision for their people, to the extent that they have, started farming projects, have lobbied the DG Murray Trust to come and be present in, really outstanding individuals who have a real heart for their people and a vision for how this might take shape over 30 years kind of thing. And I guess our role has generally been to apply the brakes to kind of say, let's be thoughtful about this. Let's just make sure we're walking at a pace that we can sustain here and engaging the right people, and also being realistic about there's some things we can solve and some things that with everyone's best intentions are really just still constraints that are going to be really hard to work around. So, and in some ways, I felt like I've let the chief down. I feel like I'm disappointing him by not getting his schools to, but that's the reality. And then on the other hand, some challenging relationships. And I think as an organization, it's always a two-way relationship, right? You're also going to make mistakes along the way, but if there is a local authority figure who's undermining the work in schools, it can be very detrimental, and I'm sure we've all had that experience. But I guess the message is that traditional figures still have a huge sway, and sometimes not in good ways, can be very threatening to local staff that we might employ, and particularly if they hold powerful seats on hospital boards or school governing bodies, etc. So those do need to be managed very carefully. That's probably the take on.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Zonke, I mean, the LEAP Institute, you guys have got a deep history of starting schools in rural areas. What's your take on this, and where have you seen it working really well?
Well, I mean, based on, first of all, these structures, in my opinion, are never working together. And that's also part of the challenge, is that if the chief was sitting down with the department and saying, what do we want to do with the schools in our village, our work would be much more easier. So particularly the first work we are having to do is first that work, making sure that there's alignment, at least in the conversations that are happening. But based on the last question we answered, Eastern Cape, just as a province, I think everyone in this call would agree that it's such a deficit province. Everyone is looking at the province and saying, yeah, tried and tested, too much corruption, nothing really works in the province. And even when we were starting to work there, even from a funding perspective, the funders are saying, look, we're not trying to speak negatively about the province, but we don't think what you guys are trying to do. Many people have tried. And what we are saying about this province is manifesting in the people of the province as well. So when you speak to some of the people in the villages, they sit in so much deficit because they've been let down for so much and for so many times. People have come, promised things, they've never happened, and so on. So it's been absorbed and internalized by the fiber of the community where they feel like, Eastern Cape, nothing really works. So whenever you're doing development work, that's the mentality you have to fight through all the time. It's the mentality that says we are only here to receive and we sit in the deficit, we don't have, we don't have. So part of what we've been doing as the Leap Institute is to do what we call asset-based community development work before we enter any community. And what we do there is we use the school as a venue and we invite anyone and everyone in the community. So your chiefs, your sangomas, pastors, business forums, they come together at a school because whether we like it or not, schools are still respected entities, even in rural communities. When the principal calls out a community meeting, people respond. And so everyone comes and we have a 2-day conversation where day one we are saying, what are the assets of this community? Because as much as we are here as the Leap Institute, tomorrow we might not be. We are outsiders of this community. So until you are able to look at each other and see what the assets are and be able to self-organize, you are not dependent on any councillor, on any chief, because you as a community have got your ownership. And so they spend day one really identifying the assets. Oh, we've got that woman, that mama over there who's able to do sewing, that one that is a retired teacher. So by day one, the walls are full of assets of the community. By day two, they look around and say, all right, even though we've got these assets, we still have gaps. So how do we use the assets that we have to fill some of the gaps that we have in the community? So drug addiction, we have retired policemen that can be able to pull together a community forum, safety forum, and they can be able to do something. So they go through their own journey of really asking themselves, who are we as a community and what assets do we have? So that type of work is really that paradigm shift type of work of moving away from saying, Leap Institute, what can you give us, to Leap Institute, this is our journey, this is where we need you. So they tell us where they need us to be able to work a journey with them. So and that's helpful in at least bringing alignment in these different structures that we are talking about. Because for the first time, the principal is held accountable, not just by the department, but by the chief as well and by the community that says, we've been watching children from this community. 10 o'clock children are outside, they're smoking. Principal, what are you doing? School management, what are you doing? So that accountability comes from the school, but it's not just accountability, it's also saying we're here to help. So I'll be part of the group that makes sure that the children are in class by 8 o'clock and so on. And this is coming from the community. So that's one. But the biggest asset about a rural community is the fact that rural communities have been communities that are anchored around culture. So the identity of an African people manifests so well in rural communities. And that's the difference. Having worked and grown up in a township, that's the beauty of rural communities, is that the cultural aspect of it is the biggest asset, because from birth to death, there are rituals and cultural practices that bring the community together, but also form the identity of the town. So for an example, one of the practices um, of the Xhosa culture, particularly in the Eastern Cape, is when a child is born, when the umbilical cord falls off, it gets buried into the kraal of the yard. And what that means is that if I meet Viwe here in Gauteng and I ask Viwe, where is your umbilical cord buried? Viwe will say it's in Queenstown in this village with that chief. And the question there is an identity question. We are connecting based on identity. So how then do, in a science class, talk to children about climate change and the green economy when the children have been detached from the land themselves? So there's wisdom in the history and the cultural practices of these children that needs to be brought into the classroom and be seen as an asset. So when children feel like we have to move out of the rural areas to come to the cities, that's the identity they feel like they need to share. They need to share the identity of rural education and wisdom and become city and township children, because it's not cool to be be in that rural space or rural mindset. So for us, it's once that ABCD has happened and we've managed to align the community of what the priorities are, it's then how do we collect the cultural wisdom as an asset and bring it into the classroom? They are different accent, Xhosa accents in terms of English. Their way of being is a huge asset. They must be able to step in any space and be able to carry themselves as proud rural children. So for us, it's those two aspects. It's
Thanks.
identify the assets, but secondly, bring them into the classroom.
Thanks, Sonke. I mean, what you made me think about is this whole idea of empowerment, right? So you try, how do you empower the community, what exists, as opposed to thinking they need to get something from somewhere or somebody. That's the one thing. And then the other one that you've made me think about, and in fact, it's come up in all the responses, is this idea of, do we need to be setting up not necessarily policy, but certainly teaching systems, pedagogy structures that might be different based on context. You know, as a country, we quite scared, well, not scared, it's the, you know, certain groups getting certain education systems versus others. You know, we've got a very scarred history. So, but, you know, there might be something about rural education that's specific and that can land better and help with education in a different way if considered, you know. So I mean that's a much bigger topic that I know very little about, but you've made me think about that, you know. So thank you. Viwe, I'm going to hand back to you, and I think, you know, based on the time, we should probably get some questions, and I see Craig's answered one already. Thanks for doing that, Craig. But are there any other questions?
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat, and I think any of the speakers can respond to this one from Umtobisi, who says, for rural learners who rarely see STEM professionals in daily life, how do we bridge the exposure gap to spark their curiosity and keep them motivated throughout their learning journey and ensure that our learners remain in the classroom?
Actually, I think my last comment was also sparked by because I saw Toby's question that I mean if we're really expecting children to stay curious in the classroom, their context need to be brought into the classroom so that they're interested. It's
Yeah,
familiar,
makes sense.
right? So it's the same as when we complain, and it's a reality. So I'm not downplaying this, but when we factor in the fact that children are not reading, for an example, and that's true, children are not reading, but it's also because the stories are detached from their reality. So how do we bring stories that make children go, oh, that's amazing! I want to read the next chapter. So stories, I feel particularly for rural children there are other stories out there, and I know Sis Mhlophe does amazing work in trying to capture, these type of stories, but we need more of rural contextual stories about science. Rural communities knew what to do around reading planets and science and astrology. That wisdom still exists till today, and that's wisdom that children, in affirming their own identity, needs to be told that you don't have to go to the city for you to be a relevant citizen in this country. You are as enough as you are in the classroom. So obviously, I think for me, it is really unearthing the wisdom that is still in the rural areas, but also making sure that the teachers themselves don't negotiate children out of that identity because they think you'll only be something if you go to Wits and Gauteng. Don't stay here. Don't be part of this community.
I think, sorry, if I can just come in, obviously I can't answer the specifics around sort of the STEM approach and as it moves up in terms of education, but really from an ECD base, it was just stemmed by what was previously being said is we've been very fortunate because when we look at curriculum and we look at how we develop it from an ECD perspective, it really was understanding how do we leverage the cultural context for young children. You're talking about those really early years and foundations that we're creating that makes it something that's familiar to them, but then also scaffolds what that learning will be. As you say, you need to build on the value chain that's already there by building on what they are accustomed to, what they're used to seeing, versus bringing in concepts and themes. If it's as basic as themes, you can't bring in, something that might be very astronomical in terms of context into a rural village, if children at those foundations haven't even been exposed to those things, you will gradually integrate it to build that curiosity and build on that foundation of what it is that they're learning about. But I agree, the context of what we are generating in terms of curriculum and context, and maybe how we approach it, also needs to be something that does get considered. But it is very difficult when we work in a system where things are very standardized. We talk about it as a gap to say, well, how do we bridge the gap between rural and sort of more urban settings? The reality is the context is going to be different, so it needs an adaptive approach, which is maybe something that needs consideration. But again, it's a very big topic, and it's understanding how do you work. I love what was being said with the assets and the culture and things that are there that you're already embedding in those foundations, but integrated into something that's going to leverage them to not feel that there's this difference between going to a rural school versus, needing to be sent to a city or a more urban setting.
Thank you so much, Mary. Are there any other questions from the audience? You're also free to put your hand up and we can unmute and you can ask the panelists directly. Nanine?
Sorry, just take some time to unmute. And thank you so much for the inspirational conversation. I've been going through the websites a bit, and I think it's so exciting, gives so much hope, and you're also well spoken. I'd love to know from Zonke, I see you also have emotional well-being approach, which I find very encouraging, just to create space, to work through as a holistic human being, not just getting that next goal reached in terms of education, but also just taking stock of how you are doing. If you could just speak a bit about the role of that and also how you make it part of the ecosystem in terms of building capacity for people in rural settings, please.
Thanks for the question, Lily. So in our lead schools, we had adopted this model that says if each of our schools is working to serve a particular community, then at least the model needs to speak to the needs of that particular community. And having been a lead student myself, I know that, as I shared earlier on, growing up in Langa, that so much happens that you learn very early on to numb your emotions. So I learned very early on that if someone was being raped yesterday, someone was killed tomorrow, and all of these happening, and mind you, it's not like I had a space where I could sit around a dinner table and answer the question how my day was. So that structure did not exist for me in my family. And that went for majority of the children that go for me. So because children don't have safe spaces at home to process, articulate their emotions, how do we create that in a schooling environment? So we use the life orientation subject, which is the most unpopular subject in South Africa, but it's got good enough topics that we feel at the adolescent stage, that's where children should be exploring things like identity, sexuality, and so on. So how do we use those topics to really create a space where peer voice is what matters, but children can be able to go from I think to I feel and understand what that means in identifying their emotions. So 40 minutes a day using the life orientation period, children sit in a circle and they speak to each other about what they're going through, but they are kept accountable by each other in their own peer voices. So it's just a safe space for them to be able to process emotions.
That's wonderful. Would you label it peer support, or is it more about helping people to have a conversation that they won't have any other space to have?
It's more emotional support and behavior shifting, but more than happy to have that conversation with you. I'll try to say more about it. Don't want to distract this conversation.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Any other audience questions before we go to closing? All right. I don't know if any of the speakers want to have a last word. We've got bit more of a light-hearted question, which is what surprised you most about working in rural communities and with economically disadvantaged schools? Any of the panelists can speak on that.
Quick one from me.
Sorry.
Sorry. I know I spoke about, the deficit and how majority of the people in the villages sometimes have lost hope in terms of the future, but it's mostly the adults, man. The children are amazing. The children are sitting 100 children in a grade 12 class, but the minute you engage with them, yes, they're dreaming big and they're speaking about possibilities that they've never even, they know that it will be difficult to get to, but they are so hopeful. So I think this work on these conversations are important because we cannot be dimming those lights. It's us, the adults, that sometimes dim the lights of the children. So for me, what surprised me is even in the most deficit-stricken spaces in the schools that we're working in, the children are always the biggest asset.
Thank you so much, Zonke. Mary?
I'll keep it very short and sweet and build on what's already just been said. I think for me personally, it was really just the resilience and resilience of the communities and understanding what they face. And the fact that they show up every day, they find sometimes solutions to challenges that we sometimes can't understand unless you're actually put in their situation. But yes, definitely want to say, you can take any type of situation or context, and if you just go and observe those children that are living in those communities, often they are not even aware of some of the very significant and challenging circumstances that they are facing, because I loved what you said, that hopefulness, and that's why I referenced resilience. It really is because they have a different perspective and are hopeful for what the future will bring, even in situations of uncertainty.
Thank you so much, Mary. Craig, not to put you on the spot, do you have anything you want to share?
I'll build. So yeah, I think for me as well, it's the young people. So we employ a bunch of young people who on paper have no qualifications, really shouldn't have any business in being kind of doing anything meaningful, and yet put them in classrooms with kids from their community, and they are the most powerful, skilled, energetic, caring facilitators of learning. And I think those are the faces behind the massive, like 65% unemployment, right? But yet they have so much to offer if we can harness that. So that's the thing that continues every week when I see them to surprise me. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Again, a very big thank you to our panelists and to you all as an audience for being engaging. It was a very interesting conversation. So please do keep an eye on your emails for the next episode, still under the same topic, because I think there's a lot more that can be said. And then as well, in the context of Eastern Cape, we'll have our networking event on Friday. So if you want to come and build on the conversation, meet some of the panelists who'll be present, it's at 1:00, and we'll share a reminder via email tomorrow as well. So thank you so much, everyone, and hope you have a good day.
Thanks, Viwe. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.